Is Broadcom going to be the big winner in this whole AI chip race? We'll find out. You're watching Techstrong Gang. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Techstrong Gang. We have some of our usual stalwarts, Dan O'Brien, Mitch Ashley, Chris Blask, and we're going to have a chat about some of the latest and greatest events of the day, starting off with this whole deal between OpenAI and Broadcom for custom chips. Dan, let's just get started here. What's your take on what's going on here? Because as far as I can tell, all these companies are making their own chips at this point. Is that where we're headed?
Well, certainly a lot of them are making their own chips. A few of them still buying from NVIDIA too, I think we know. But certainly Broadcom has been the leader, for a while now in really what we call XPU, these custom AI accelerators. Been working with a variety of companies in that space. Google being the best known on the TPU side. And the kind of news that we got today is, seemingly the big announcement of this week. We get one every week these days. About $10 billion, 10 gigawatts of silicon being purchased by OpenAI in partnership with Broadcom. So, likely clusters that are going to be going towards inference. OpenAI has long been rumored to be interested in making their own silicon. I think, Broadcom's long rumored to have been that potential partner. And, now we get just a sense of the scale of the investment. This follows, 10 gigawatts of capacity from NVIDIA, 6 gigawatts from AMD. So OpenAI has certainly been on a buying spree here. But, I think they're really trying to rationalize their training needs as well as their inference needs over the long term, right? I think we're going to continue to see annual upgrades of NVIDIA equipment on the training side. And, for those more stable inference workloads, they're going to, really optimize on costs for power. And, really Broadcom seems to be the winner here in terms of that being that preferred OpenAI partner.
Do me a favor for the uninitiated, split that conversation a little bit for me, because I think people get confused about what chips are used for what. But there are some chips that lend themselves for training, and then there's inference, which is the deployment of the AI workloads. So these are not really overlapping deals. They're kind of complementary, but sort that out a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, training is really where we see much more of the model building as you get into, new iterations and next generation models. New data sets coming in, new training and reinforcement learning techniques. That's really where you see the GPU shining. And then on the inference side is where making calls, entering queries, entering prompts, then churning those tokens to get a response back. That's really the inference side of the equation. So different needs. One's at a completely different scale than the other. You'll have far more inference over time than you will training, but these training runs are incredibly expensive. The ability to do them quickly is really important as you think about time to market in the model wars. And I think we're seeing a little bit of the maturing of the AI compute story where you're really starting to get into that specialization, and customers are really starting to rationalize across not just performance, but cost, and what ultimately seems to be a big gate right now, the power side of things.
Yeah. Mitch, this is another one of those $10. Sorry, try that again. Mitch, this is another one of those $10 billion deals that seem to be commonplace in the AI thing. But the one thing that kind of leaps out at me a little bit here to what Dan was just talking about is, are we separating training and inference? And is inference going to be managed more by traditional IT folks, DevOps folks who are going to be optimizing the workloads when they're deployed? And the training will stay with the data science teams, and we won't have one data science team trying to do everything.
Well, there are two very different workloads. It's a really good point. And not everybody's in the model building business, right? Most of us are not going to build very, very large, maybe even small models, at least for the time being. It's a big cost. It's a lot of effort, and certainly a specialized skill. But inferencing can apply to anything. It can apply to any app that's using, AI algorithms and processing those models. So I think we'll see much more common kind of farms of inferencing across edge devices, centralized data centers, et cetera. And that's where we want to be able to push workloads to where that's best to happen. So I think that's probably also why you're seeing a more plethora of deals is, we talk so much about NVIDIA's latest, whatever the generation is, and how much faster it is and how much more power it takes, because that is such a huge, massive workload to train models versus inferencing. Yeah, it's a big workload, but not nearly the same intensity.
Mm-hmm. Chris, does that make sense to you as well, or what are you saying?
Honestly, I like the direction this is going. I was thinking, looking at this segment, more about chip sovereignty and owning the power and the fabs and so forth. But this is a good point. We've talked about this a lot over the weeks, right? These workloads are different things. Just scaling massive data centers to do massive things and using that for everything doesn't make any sense. So I think I like what Mitch and Dan was saying about this. You don't need all that for all of this. And every time we say that we need all of that to do anything, it shows that we don't understand the systems we're building.
Mm-hmm. Dan, another thing about this is that it feels like to me that the inference workloads are going to be more distributed, and there's going to be a lot more networking involved in it. There's a whole other element of the stack here that goes into this thing that people need to think through, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think with the exception of somebody like Google, who's doing this, they're training over multiple data centers because they've got their own TPU. Most of the big model trainers are really trying to almost train within a single data center complex because of the the networking complexity there. So, to Mitch's point, there's going to be a very small number of companies that really need to worry about these large training clusters. OpenAI is obviously one of them, and to be determined whether there's a real business model just in making models, right? I think we're seeing that layer of the stack is highly commoditized. You're really able to monetize it at the application layer, and the application layer is where a lot of people are going to have inference workloads. So I think it's a very different type of workload, very, very different scale in terms of the number of companies that will need to worry about training versus inference. Inference is something that everyone needs to worry about. Training is really going to be at the hands of few.
I wonder, Mitch, will we see some blueprints out of this kind of thing where maybe, OpenAI and Broadcom will get together and say, hey, here's how you deploy an inference engine and make it simpler for folks? Because one of the things I think out there is that there's not a lot of IT people with expertise deploying inference engines.
Well, I think to some degree, that's something we'll see. I think we're going to talk about in our next segment too, is part of building AI applications or agents, et cetera, there are frameworks to build these within. And that's where you get some of those blueprints from. And I need a sandbox to be able to perform those actions in. So as we get more and more of the frameworks set up, I think that'll help us with what are those patterns, those blueprints, et cetera. And, just as it matures more and we figure more of that out, I think we'll see those kind of things. But there's all kinds of frameworks that we haven't begun to talk about around AI and agents, but we'll get a chance too soon, I'm sure.
I'm not sure OpenAI wants to provide the framework. I think OpenAI really wants to become a CSP, right? I mean, I think this, they're trying to somewhat cut out the middleman. You think about the margin stacking from semi-equipment into fabs, fabs into fabless into, the kind of end customer. They're really trying to decrease the number of layers there because there's so much margin squeeze as you kind of go further down the stack. So, I think we've traditionally thought in the enterprise about, really 3 or 4 big hyperscalers, AWS, Google, Microsoft, Oracle. I think we, in the AI world, we're going to think about Meta, OpenAI, and maybe a handful of others. Maybe one of the neo clouds gets there, as kind of these large CSPs.
Well, let me take frameworks for a second, because this is one of these things. And I spent a lot of in the last half decade and throughout my career, a lot of time in working groups and frameworks and, God help me, how many times we're going to take 6 to 18 months to get a draft of the first version of the whatever. And in this world, and I'm coming hot out of that space and still in it during this transition period, and just the idea that we're going to take 12 months to agree on a draft of a framework, for example, or that we're going to wait for one big monolithic company or a coalition of 3 monolithic companies over a period of 36 months. No, that's not the way it works. And this gets right down into, I think, the nature of this, where there haven't been a lot of conversations. I haven't been part of them, but how do you have a working group? How do you come up with frameworks? What does frameworks even look like in a world that moves at this speed? Because we have multi-decade framework development processes that produce individual handfuls of documents and frameworks that slowly coalesce. I think that goes to 11 starting about now. A framework, again, we all do different things, but we're not, necessarily all on the camera. And we are involved in developing frameworks and propagating them from the bottom up. And is that a way a lot of these things get developed and deployed as opposed to waiting from the top down? I think too early to tell, but it's not, this is not the, pick one. This is not the NIST cybersecurity framework redux. This is frameworks and processes and schemas that propagate much more rapidly.
It's a good point, Chris, because we use the term frameworks in a lot of different ways. You mentioned NIST frameworks, right? It's really a plan, a process, set of guidelines, things to implement. It's a structure within implementing security, for example. In the software world, we also use the word frameworks to mean the scaffolding, the code that actually you need to be built around your agents to operate it. So you're not building the whole pipeline and how it works and how it starts up and how it fails over and how it communicates, all of those kind of things. So we call that scaffolding. But those frameworks, just like there's frameworks in code for doing user interface and data communications, data analysis and data transformation. So when people are building software, building agents, they're typically going to be using some kind of a framework, quote unquote, which means libraries of code or even operating code to run those agents within some kind of a context.
Right. So Dan, I'm going to use a technical term here, but one of the things that I like about this whole deal is it's pretty straightforward and there's not a lot of what I might refer to as financial engineering shenanigans involved. So can you compare how this deal is to all these other deals that we've seen lately where there seems to be a whole lot of co-investment and a lot of people are confused?
Yeah, I think this one is a little bit more straightforward. It does seem like it's a little bit more, kind of cash for hardware, if you will. I think the NVIDIA deal with OpenAI was much more around, kind of the data center site build itself, and less, kind of paying them to then buy back the GPUs. The AMD deal with OpenAI, is probably the most unique of all of them. That's really a, kind of more of an equity-driven deal where, at a certain level of kind of purchases and a certain level of stock price for AMD, OpenAI has, the opportunity to kind of take an equity stake there. So, very different, kind of structures. It's certainly getting creative here. I think the one thing that gives me some comfort that this isn't a real sign of the bubble, is that these are, largely very profitable companies essentially committing their future free cash flows, right? This is not a debt-driven, purchase environment yet.
It's not the late 90s of financing startups with leveraged investment, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So following that up one more time, then will we see the OpenAI rivals do the exact same thing? So Anthropic will kind of maybe sit down with AWS and design a chip, and other folks will be with Google, and this is just the first in a wave of these things.
I certainly think Anthropic's a big AWS user of, their Trainium chips and, some of the other silicon in their portfolio. Anthropic's a different level of complexity, right? You've got big AWS investments there. You've got big Google investments there. You've also got a lot of VC money involved there. Anthropic certainly operating on a different level and scale than OpenAI, though. Anthropic, I think, is really, kind of centered in and around the code use case, more than that general purpose.
Mm-hmm. And then what does this mean for Intel and all the chip makers? Are the folks at Intel sitting there chewing their sleeves off because they didn't get this deal? Or, what are the implications for the rest of the semiconductor world?
I think we'll need to see, right? To some degree, this may mean, the Intel announcement is a week or two away, right? You've kind of seen OpenAI filter through kind of the who's who of big compute and big AI accelerators with NVIDIA, AMD, now Broadcom. I think with a lot of the government support going behind Intel right now, wouldn't surprise me to see, either some manufacturing deals or, some outright deals to purchase, x86 silicon or, some of the accelerators going out of Intel.
So is there a snowball's chance in hell that Broadcom will use fabs from Intel? What do you think? Possible?
I think it's possible for almost all companies in the American semiconductor ecosystem right now to think about using Intel. Probably hardest for AMD to get their head around, just because of the governance structure, in place at Intel. I think they'd want to, really see a little bit more separation in governance between the foundry side and the design side of the house. But whether it's Apple, whether it's AWS, Google, Broadcom, NVIDIA, be it the actual semiconductor wafer foundry or, even more likely, I think the advanced packaging side of Intel, I think there's going to be continued momentum in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's because of the U.S. investment, Dan, in Intel?
Yeah. Listen, I think the government's actually been pretty transparent about things if you're willing to listen, and there's quid pro quos on the table, and, it seems like everybody's getting on board.
So let me ask the next logical question, at least in my mind anyway. Dan, am I going to wake up one morning and see like a massive merger in the semiconductor space because somebody's just going to say, well, if we're orchestrating all these companies in some sort of national policy, we might as well just bring them all together?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, you've got to get through, China's MOFCOM, essentially the, equivalent on our side of the regulatory body. I don't think that's really possible. I mean, be it the steady equipment side or the semiconductor side, doing large scale acquisitions has gotten really tough there. I mean, there's been a lot of these that have been, kind of shut down. And I think, probably a little bit more of an aversion to trying to do these given the recent history of regulatory rulings.
All right. Mitch, I'm going to throw this one to you. So am I reading this correctly a little bit? But we kind of built this AI stuff on, we found a bunch of GPUs, they seemed to work, and away we went. But if I look at this custom chip, am I going to see more of the lower level frameworks and software that we've been using to build some of this stuff embedded deeper into the chip itself? And maybe the processing will get better and the overhead will get better. And maybe these OpenAI things will become a little more efficient. And who knows, maybe we might not need as many data centers. Follow my logic?
Oh, optimization, efficiency. Yeah, that's my Halloween voice, by the way. Yes, no, absolutely. Specialized, more efficient, power efficient, as well as increase in speed and processing, and workload. We'll see. I will see a lot of innovation. We think of inferencing and GPUs for model training as kind of big monolith process. There's already specialized chips for doing this today, and it'll do nothing more than get more specialized.
Chris, is that on your wish list? More stuff at the chip level?
Yes, no, I'll take all of it, please. Thank you very much.
Just want one on your desktop. That's all, right?
Right.
There you go.
Under the desk.
NVIDIA's got one for you.
Preferably sooner than later. All right, folks, the world is changing one more time, but I got news for you, man. It's all going to be happening at the semiconductor level, and these deals are all coming fast and furious, and what we see today is going to look pretty antiquated from what we're going to see tomorrow. We'll be back in a minute.
You've earned it. The spotlight, the responsibility, the weight of teams, companies, and entire industries fall on your shoulders. Lives depend on your decisions, your home life included. At work, you're protected, physically and digitally. Nothing gets through your team without a fight. But in a globally connected world, everyone sees you, including those who mean to cause you and your organization harm. And now home, your sanctuary. Attackers see an opportunity. Your digital front door is wide open. And what compromises your home can breach your boardroom. Because the devil's greatest trick isn't targeting your workplace firewall. It's convincing you that your personal life isn't at risk. Black Cloak. Digital executive protection, defending the new attack surface, your personal life.
Hey, folks, we're back. And as Mitch alluded to, yes, the second segment is related to the first segment. We're talking about how AWS has now made generally available a serverless computing platform designed specifically for AI agents. And the basic idea here is that they have like 7 primitives that are all exposed through a single API. And from my IDE or my favorite AI tool. I can now just go build and deploy AI agents. No DevOps people or IT people required. In a sense, AWS is the IT and the DevOps people for this thing. Mitch, I can't help but wonder, we've been talking about serverless forever. And at one point we were like, oh, serverless is going to take over everything. And then it didn't. But are AI agents going to be kind of like a killer app for serverless because, well, they're just so damn spiky?
Well, you think about it, agents are natural for serverless, and I don't mean in a native Lambda sense, but agents are really kind of meant to be small, do workloads of specialized kind of processing, reasoning, etc. And when AWS announced Agent Core, I mean, it was GA now, but it was really just in July at the New York event that they launched it. That was setting in motion what the next kind of development cycle looks like, which is now being referred to as agentic development lifecycle. So how do you build applications or build functions, build software that it's composed of components, agents that are meant to operate agentically? So you've got to have this environment for them to do that. It doesn't help us to write agents and then have to build whole environments to operate them on. We want to be able to set those things loose in a sandbox environment or in a production environment. And that's exactly what Agent Core set about to do. It doesn't solve all the elements of what you would have in a traditional software development lifecycle, but it does a lot of them. I mentioned earlier, now this is GA now, so a relatively short period of time, just a matter of months. This thing is now ready for use. But it also is supporting of multiple frameworks. Microsoft just launched their agent framework a few months ago, maybe in less than a month ago. But you've got, LangGraph, OpenAI Agent SDK. I can't remember the name of all of them. Strands. There's a whole bunch of them. Crew AI that have all come about, and people are starting to use. We'll see if some tend to take off more than others. So that's the framework that those agents are built around. Think of them as an SDK. But then also there's something really interesting about Agent Core is it has Agent Core Code Interpreter, which is a safe execution environment for code to be able to run. So that's how you can kind of think of it as memory safe, like we think about in languages like Rust. But it also has a browser functionality for web interaction. If you write Python code, you're very familiar with libraries that do that. A runtime that scales the infrastructure, and then a gateway that can talk to functions like Lambda and other services. So it includes MCP and A2A. So that's that execution environment that we're talking about. That was what Agent Core is about. So I'm excited to see, people start to use this and take off. And of course, AWS is talking about Clearwater Analytics, Ericsson, and Sony, and others using this already. I'm sure there are a number of companies that are using Agent Core.
Mm-hmm. Dan, am I going to see Microsoft and Google follow suit? I suspect that they already are. I think Google has an enterprise initiative that has some sort of serverless framework in there. But is this going to be like the next great infrastructure battle around AI agents?
Yeah, listen, I think all the hyperscalers are trying to make it easier for developers to, build and deploy and manage agents, right? I mean, I think what they're doing here is putting a nice wrapper around, really what are the kind of winning open standards in the space, like MCP and A2A. They're making it so that it really plays really well and really nicely within their existing cloud services ecosystem. And they're solving some of the harder challenges that, everybody is worried around with agents, right? You've got the identity challenges, around identity access management, the observability, right? What are these agents doing? Where are they going? What kind of, compute capacity are they consuming? So, I think it's really about kind of removing the friction and, just getting their developers up and running, because all of these cloud service companies know the more that they get their builders out there building agents, the more compute they will consume and the higher the bill will go, right? Like it's a nice little self-reinforcing, economic loop for the cloud provider.
Big bills coming your way. Chris, here's the part of this that leaves me perplexed. So maybe you can sort this out for me. So theoretically, I want the AI agent to be deployed somewhere as close as possible to where the data it is consuming is. And most of the time, the data is in an on-premise environment or some local data center. There's data lakes up in the cloud, obviously, but I don't know what percentage of everybody's data is up there. But ultimately, is where the data is located going to drive the decision about where to deploy the AI agent, or are people just going to start, buying those big, what did I forget? The AWS renamed them, but they were called snowballs, and they were basically big boxes that you came and loaded on a truck with your data, and then it showed up in the cloud like a week later.
I don't know that I can answer that question. I think the answer is yes, right? But I think of the pros and cons of this, and Dan and Mitch, cover the pros pretty well. Dan used the word that was on the tip of my tongue, friction, right? If we can reduce the friction for not just existing dev teams, startups, how fast can I have access to these things? How much upfront work do I need to do? That's fantastic. I worry about, I see lock-in city, like, holy cow, now I never get to do anything else again. And transparency, right? Like, who cares where my brain's running as long as it answers fast? I want receipts for where things are happening and loads and so forth. But data residency, there's a lot of issues up and down the stack. But this feels to me like one of these. I couldn't say better than you two to begin with, because this is happening. It's too easy. It's too good. So look at the downsides. Can I tell what's actually happening? Does my ease of use as a dev team or as a startup and so forth lock me into choices that I may not have really signed off on? And these early stages are exactly the times when those sort of mistakes get baked in, and we talk about them a lot later on.
Oh, Chris, come on in. The water's fine over here. Don't be concerned about any of those things.
Oh, yeah.
We're not going to do anything to try and lock you in. No, it's all
Right.
about customer acquisition, right? Getting their workloads on there. And, the open standards are some things that help you with that. But when you're in Agent Core, or you're in a different execution environment, Dan, you mentioned, observability, security guardrails, memory management of agents. All those things are part of that scaffolding you need to be able to do all that. That's what these environments and frameworks all do. And you don't unhook those things easily. It isn't like, oh, good, let's just take that and drop that in another cloud, right? It doesn't quite work that easily. You have to re-engineer it. It may be easy, it may be hard, but the more I can get you to learn, use, and like what I've produced in terms of our environment, Agent Core in this case, all the better. Now, the other thing I was going to mention too is there's digital sovereignty issues around this, and that's an interesting dilemma. I mean, the hyperscalers have responded to say, here's how we'll solve digital sovereignty in these areas. But I think you'll have other people who will come up with in execution environments, other vendors that aren't hyperscalers, that you can do an on-prem version of that in your environment. We haven't talked about, is there an on-prem version of Agent Core yet? Not yet, anyway.
There might be one day soon if AWS follows its usual playbook, though. Although, Dan, I was thinking about these issues too, and then I was like, well, these things are all true, but going forward, might it not become easier to move my data from one platform to the next? And AI agents are not kind of like full boat apps. They're kind of like little disposable things, and maybe I can not worry about the fact that I need to migrate one. I'm just going to blow it up and replace it with another one running over here somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going on the path that I wanted to talk about here, Mike, as well. What I didn't hear enough from AWS was, are we actually building this for the human developer, or are we building this for the vibe coding agent, right? At this point, the main user of these, agent builder tools may be agents themselves. And to your point, Mike, that may be as simple as, in your vibe coding prompt, all right, great. Now this works. Now build it for me over here, using this proof of concept, as a framework, right? So, I think the world of development is changing so incredibly quickly. I'm starting to wonder, who is the target user, right? Is it a person, or is it the AI?
Oh, everybody loves a good conspiracy theory, but it's true. And that's going that direction, right, Dan?
It is, absolutely. But Mitch, should we not get too attached to our AI agents? Are they in effect essentially disposable code?
Oh, they're like tribbles, You just you have one, you're going to have a lot soon. But they are disposable. I think that's a really important point that you're making there. Is AI is creating agents for us. It's already doing that today, right? We're using at least code assisted, if not largely code generated by AI, to do much of this. So why not do an A/B contest, right? I'm going to have 3 different agents built by different models and compete, see which ones perform, which ones I like best or easier to manage, which ones can scale better, whatever it might be. So I think we'll be very unattached to our agents in that way. I think the things that are agents that are more like personal assistants that know me and know my preferences and what kind of emails I like to respond to or not, or all those kind of things, that's where that preference will gain an attachment to. And, we'll have the rosy robots, from the Jetsons that will, mope around the office.
I'm glad because we keep using this acronym AI to stand for everything, right? We may as well just say magic at this point, right? And AI, a semantic. These are semantic systems, right? So we have large language models, word engines, call them what you want, and a large language model, as an agent performing tasks in an industrial workflow is a semantic engine doing semantic things. And you said it, a civic AI, some named entity, the persona that knows who you are, who it is, where it's been, where it's going is a different thing. And, and acronyms mean things. I am still pissed off that security information management got embedded with an E, events, security information and event management, which is because events are not information, right? No, the way words we use mean things. And when we're using words about word engines, it's kind of important to get it right. So an AI agent is not artificial intelligence. It's a semantic workflow tool. And a persona, personal assistant, is artificial and intelligent. Fine, we can use that if we want. But they're different things entirely. The fact that we're using electrons here doesn't make everything, just electronic systems.
I've known you a long time, Chris, and still haven't gotten over that SIM issue. Okay.
God. Words we use, right?
I'm gonna end this here, but Chris just gave me a great idea. I think we're gonna have a whole episode for Festivus Day, and it will be the airing of grievances.
A lot of AI grievances, yeah.
All right, folks, we'll be back in a minute with our last block.
Discover Techstrong Group, the epicenter of tech innovation. We're your go-to for reaching IT leaders and practitioners worldwide. Our secret? Impactful content that sparks awareness, engagement, and top-quality leads. With us, you'll access editorial websites, streaming videos, virtual events, custom content, analyst research, and more. Join our satisfied clients. Let's revolutionize your tech journey. Contact us today and tell your story to the world in the most powerful way with Techstrong Group.
Hey folks, we're back, returning to an issue that we talk a lot about on this show, but DevSecOps and Git. And there's a white paper out from the folks at Google and a couple of universities describing how you could build end-to-end encryption into your Git repository, and that will protect them from various forms of attacks and malicious code. And to me, Chris, this sounds like a really good idea, but as I thought about it more and more, I said, well, what the hell have we been doing all these years? Because why don't we have encryption in a Git repository? It seems like a natural thing we should be doing.
Well, welcome to security. Thanks for coming along. Right. The overarching frameworks and concepts of security are not new. We can go back to Sun Tzu and enunciate it. And in our era, the oldest amongst us, said this the first time when they were the youngest amongst us, and we're not there yet. And this one, I love this one. We use GitHub as repositories, attestation repositories for everything, right? This is the whole digital bill of materials idea from 2019 that you can have. What we need is attestations between entities, nodes, call them what you will, about things. And GitHub, as it turns out, is a good strata for that. And when I looked at this, today's segments is like, yeah, well, why haven't we done that all along? What are we using so far? Hope. Hope is a wonderful thing. I think this is a better idea. For our part, we actually do, as appropriate, more things on top of that because we use GitHub for everything. But should it get baked in? Yes. It could be a short segment. Just yes. How about that?
There you go. Mitch, is this gonna, if we actually do this, gonna replace the need for a lot of the tools that we seem to be wrapping around our Git repositories to secure them in this DevSecOps flow? But I'm not sure this is a silver bullet, but how far do you think it goes?
Well, it's interesting. We're at this inflection point where Microsoft is really starting to fold in GitHub into the company. They announced they're moving their operations onto Azure infrastructure and the ops into the Microsoft Ops group. Well, you know what happens when you start working with Microsoft is security jumps right up and bites you because it's a big deal, right? I can just imagine what their ops group would be saying of, okay, here's what we need. I mean, I filled out a lot of those forms as a partner, and I can imagine what the internal ones look like. My point being is, they have bigger designs, and they've not announced all of this yet. There's rumors about internal meetings and stuff that have happened with Microsoft where they want to take Git because it's treated as a code repository. But I remember the first time I learned about Git, the development team was putting everything in it. They're putting their documents in there. They're putting images in there. I'm like, what are you doing? This is a source code repository. No, you could put all this stuff in it. It really is going to become almost like a content management system, but the next generation of a distributed content management system. And if that happens, Microsoft's not going to adopt it in a kind of unhinged form that it's not really secure. It's going to have to be secured. So we could be headed down on this path where it will become much more secure because it's being subsumed into Microsoft and they have bigger plans for it.
All right. I may digress here, but I thought I heard you just say that Microsoft announced something and then they actually had a meeting about how to actually do it, but that's just me. Anyway.
I hear they do that. They do that. It happens in Redmond.
Right. Dan,
I'm a fan of that approach.
Dan, what is your sense of, in the age of AI and all these agents that we were talking about earlier, will we have a greater appreciation for security, to Mitch's point, going in? Because, as Chris alluded to, we have always made it an afterthought, but is that changing in your mind? I mean, let me rephrase this. Cybersecurity actually going to be a first-class citizen in these platforms?
It seems inevitable that we're going to need to care about it more and more, right? As it's really hard to separate the digital world and the physical world. Everything in our physical world is being digitized and therefore is susceptible to security concerns. I think this is happening at a really interesting time in the market too, right? You've seen, just over the past couple of years, NIST start to ratify new post encryption, quantum encryption, security standards. And, for a big company like Microsoft to think about, fully integrating Git and, really putting security concerns first when it comes to that integration, it's maybe a chance for them to actually start to put in place some of these new, post-quantum, encryption type of standards, right? So I think that's something that's on a lot of people's minds over the next, call it 5 years, as something that probably needs to be dealt with. And, early days in terms of some of the initial, standards and actual offerings in that space coming out. But, companies like Microsoft are going to be leading the way. They have to.
Chris, you a believer?
I am notoriously the optimistic of the old, security folks, right? I believe that this is a finite issue. That there's the Star Trek and the Star Wars future views, right? And in my world, most people are of the Star Wars view that everything's awful and it'll always be awful and we'll keep doing the same things. I have a more utopian view of this, and I think take that. So that's enough of a caveat. Take it for what it's worth. I think we're approaching security as just design. And again, I'm a geek. We're geeks. We're a geeky company. We're geeky groups. So the fact that we're doing things this way, maybe it doesn't mean anything. But I'm at the point now where we can't. When we're designing things and they're not security related, we design them securely because that's the way they need to be designed. You just actually build it that way from scratch. And with the over-talked 2-letter acronym tools we have these days, I think it's and this topic itself. Git GitHub is another one of these wonderful open source structures that arose over multiple decades that is now docking inside this massive corporate entity that, as everybody else has said on the screen, is at the place that it is. And we're sitting here in a world where you can say, I need to develop this system, lay it out for me, AI, and it'll lay it out. And if you have that, if your AI teammate is properly oriented, my supposition is they will just tell you it has to be built secure, because those are fundamental things. It's not about security. It's about keeping the bloody thing running, staying out of court, not, letting down your obligations to your stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Mitch, why don't we just blow everything up and start over again? And I'm going to use the airline industry as kind of the example, right? At some point, everybody got tired of the plane crashes and they had a big meeting and they got together and made everything fundamentally better. And it seems to me, as I look around in the IT industry, everybody's kind of running around reinventing the same IT security wheels over and over again. They don't really provide differentiated value. They're important, but it's not the kind of thing you're going to decide to go with one platform versus another over. So why don't we just throw everybody in a room and sit down for, I don't know, the better part of a year and just solve all this crap?
Well, I don't know if I can sign on to your comparison of blowing things up in airplanes, but especially since I'm going to get on one in a couple days here. So, nobody take that wrong. No, interestingly, I agree with you, but in a different sense. And I've said this before on the show, is with the productivity increases using AI to create code and develop software, the current model of let me create something and then I'll scan it just to find out if it's not secure, that's wrong. That will not scale, because who's going to do something about that? Today it's people, right? Maybe we'll have agents that'll get better at that. But really, that needs to be done at the point when the code's created. It needs to be done as part of the code generation process.
Security is part of the system prompt.
Yeah, exactly. It has to be there. Otherwise, there aren't enough Dan O'Brien's, Chris Blasks, Mike Vizards, and Mitch Ashleys of the world to go chase down every one of those security vulnerabilities if we're generating 10 times as much code. So I think it's the velocity of what we can do because of AI will force that to happen. Otherwise, it falls in on itself.
Mm-hmm. So Dan, last question to you. Are we missing the opportunity here? Because if I stitch all these segments together, so AI agents are a new way of thinking about building and deploying software, and yet we seem to want to keep applying the same way we built and deployed software to this new model. And maybe we should take this moment to kind of rethink everything from the infrastructure to security. What do you say?
I say we do it. Yeah. I mean, we're generating so much code with AI now that, really implementing security as an architectural principle, as I just said a minute ago, security is part of the system level prompts. That is probably the way to go. And, listen, there's a lot of arguments out there that, starting a company fresh is the way to go now, because, you're able to really design all this stuff from the get-go. Technical debt is a massive drag on big enterprises, and recreating under a new umbrella, maybe that is the way of the future.
I think, Dan, we're headed to a future of making changes is changing all the code every time. It's not just adding a little bit something, because it isn't going to get generated every time, and more things may get generated as part of that code creation. So it's kind of a different model than the normal change something and now I'll test those bits of it and make sure that parts of it secure. A whole code base could have changed from one change.
Yeah, notice that's great.
Well, it's a surprising analogy to healthy systems, right? And healthy mental or social systems, same thing. The surviving a collapse and rebuilding is an important thing. And anybody who's just a hacker or a entrepreneur or just like playing around with anything should know this. You build a test, you build a model, it works, and you tear it apart. And if you can build it twice, then maybe you're onto something. And I think we do get attached too. As I say this out loud, I feel the anxiety because I live in this world, right? I got it working. Don't touch it. Don't touch it. Don't reboot it. But once you do, and better yet, take it apart and put it back together again. And if the second time it makes sense, it'll be better and more efficient anyways. And now you've got a healthy system. If you can't put it back together the second time, maybe you never did.
There you go. Hey, folks, you heard it here. Maybe it is time to reinvent IT. In fact, the first meeting is going to be at Dan's house at some undetermined date, but we'll see how that goes. Hey, guys, thanks for sharing your thoughts and insights. As always, they were awesome. I want to thank everybody for spending some time with us. And please stay tuned for Techstrong TV. We have an awesome lineup right behind us. And hey, once again, we'll see you tomorrow.